Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In this video, we're going to talk about the American Revolution, or more correctly, we're going to discuss the revolution before the Revolution, encompassing the years leading up to the beginning of the Anglo-American colonies' armed independence struggle against Great Britain, roughly from 1765 to 1774. With some background information before these years. We will discuss the grievances that the American colonists had against the metropole, their mother country. We will also consider long-term social and cultural trends that helped to inspire this anti-imperial struggle, ultimately leading to war between Great Britain and the American colonies. For decades in English colonial history, two major socio-cultural trends were at work in the colonies. These trends are called Anglicization and Americanization. Anglicization was a cultural shift in the Anglo-American colonies that saw the colonists begin to develop more positive feelings for England, English culture, and the British Empire as a whole. The primary drivers of Anglicization were political events like the Glorious Revolution, which saw Catholic King James II replaced by Protestant King William and Queen Mary, as well as military conflicts in which the American colonists fought England's imperial enemies, as seen, for example, during the French Indian Wars. These mutual military struggles, combined with the colonists' anti-Catholic sentiment, led the Anglo-American people to feel they were like a part of the British Empire. Additionally, trade with Great Britain helped the colonists become more attached to the mother country through the adoption of British material culture, primarily consumer goods. At the same time, though, another trend was taking root in the English American colonies: Americanization. Even as the colonists began to live more like British people, they also began to develop new beliefs and life ways that stood in contrast to how their counterparts in Great Britain lived. Americans were embracing new religious movements, as seen during the First Great Awakening, which democratized Christianity and made it more egalitarian. Americans also supported new political systems as well, longing for electoral representation both at home, their colonies, and across the sea in Great Britain. According to one famous historian, Americans were embracing a new anti-authoritarian tradition, an outlook on politics, religion, and life. We will first talk about Anglicization, how it began, how it looked, and how it contributed to the casus belli for the American Revolutionary War. In the beginning, the English colonists lived very simple lives, what some scholars think was a system that was a medieval social structure transplanted to North America. This near-medieval social system was particularly evident in colonial Virginia, pre-Bacon's Rebellion. Colonists lived in simple, one-room wattle and daub houses with thatched roofs, similar to the rural peasantry of Europe. The living model of these homes was communal as well, with a single room and storage loft being shared by all residents. As you remember, indentured servants, mostly white in the beginning, made up the colony's labor force, and they were bound and subservient to their masters, much like medieval serfs, although they lived in much closer proximity to their masters than the serfs did. They lived together in small, communal homes. Masters, like medieval lords, ruled over their peasants, and they were expected to take care of them as well, although this often did not happen, and indentured servants were usually treated poorly. Free colonists were also expected to be subservient to the landed gentry, just like the indentured servants. The gentry would host feasts, athletic competitions, horse races, and blood sports to entertain the free colonists, both those born in America and those who had survived their indentures to earn freedom. Scholars call this sort of social arrangement noblesse oblige, where the elite is expected to paternalistically take care of those beneath them. In exchange, the colonists were expected to obey the gentry's laws, serve in their militias, and vote for them in elections. Scholars call this communal paternal system the convivial community as well. This convivial arrangement was intended to keep the colonial poor from rising against the elite in order to prevent populist insurrections like Bacon's Rebellion. This convivial community would continue after the growth of plantation slavery and the establishment of slave societies in the southern colonies, from Maryland down to Georgia. This type of system existed in the North as well, but was much weaker, as the New England colonies were more democratic and the colonial wealth was more evenly divided between the common people and the elite. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, technological developments and political changes caused the Anglo-American colonies to begin the trend of Anglicization, as they felt more of a connection with the British Empire, particularly the monarchy. Many of the early colonists, especially in New England, had fled the British Isles because they did not like the King of England. But the monarchs of the late 1600s and early 1700s were fiercely Protestant, so the colonists felt that they could trust them. During this period, technological changes in the British Isles made Britain more industrial, allowing the British to export consumer goods to the American colonies, where they could be sold at a much higher profit. In response, the colonists purchased a variety of consumer goods: glassware, ceramic dinnerware, flatware, tea sets, and tobacco boxes, even decks of cards, which bore the symbols of Britain and its royalty. The colonists also purchased consumable goods like tea, coffee, and sugar, which, because they could not be produced in the North American colonies, reminded Anglo-Americans that they were part of the larger British Empire, ruled over by the King in London. The British Empire had embargo laws, which forbade colonists from purchasing certain goods from Britain's imperial rivals, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish. Nonetheless, the colonists often broke these laws, and the British Admiralty enforced the embargoes haphazardly in an arrangement that scholars have called benign neglect. Benign neglect essentially allowed the Anglo-American colonists to have their cake and eat it too when it came to their relations with the British Empire. The colonists had the freedom to control their own political and economic affairs while skirting British trade embargoes. At the same time, the colonists had a ready market for raw material commodities, fur, indigo, rice, and tobacco, and they also enjoyed the maritime protection that the British Navy afforded the colonial shipping. In the years following the French and Indian War, the British Empire would do more to enforce these embargoes, while also levying taxes on the imported goods on which the colonists had come to depend. These consumer items were much more common in the households of the coastal urban centers like Boston, New York City, and Charleston than they were in the frontier backcountry. While frontiersmen were able to purchase these goods at country stores, they tended to be more expensive in the interior than they were on the coast, due to the cost associated with transporting them over land. Consequently, frontier colonists were more likely to shun imported British consumer goods because of their price. Frontiersmen also began to associate consumption of imported goods with physical weakness and the effete culture of the cities. For example, colonial frontiersmen abjured the drinking of tea and coffee, popular beverages with the coastal elite, which also had to be imported. Frontiersmen believed that only weak, sick men drank coffee or tea. Instead, frontiersmen drank alcohol, including American-made hard cider and corn whiskey, especially at breakfast, to demonstrate their own rural culture. Even as the American colonists were being more drawn into the Atlantic world of trade, which was Anglicizing their culture, the colonists were also developing their own new and unique beliefs and life ways, which contrasted them with their counterparts in Britain. While religion was important to most 18th century Europeans, it was far more important to colonial Americans. Some of the American colonies, especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic regions, had been founded specifically for religious reasons. Even though theocratic governance was on the decline in the American colonies by the 18th century, religiosity was on the rise as evangelical Christian sects like the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Wesleyans grew in numbers and influence, especially on the frontier. These new religious sects openly questioned the hegemony of the established Puritan and Anglican elite, and in doing so, they also threatened the authority of the British monarchy as well. If God, the creator of the universe, did not have the final say in a person's spiritual destiny, as the First Great Awakening reformers taught, how could any mere man, even a king, rule over other humans? European visitors to the American colonies, especially British soldiers, were both shocked and uneasy about the religious fervor of everyday American colonists, in contrast to their own people back in Britain. Some even remarked that the colonists' revolutionary, patriot sentiment would not even exist if it were not for the goading and incitement of their religious preachers. To highlight the religiosity of the colonists, consider that during the American Revolutionary War, American troops disinterred the remains of George Whitefield, the famous preacher of the First Great Awakening, in 1775. By the way, we discussed Whitefield in a previous lecture. Although he had been dead for 5 years, the soldiers took pieces of Whitefield's burial clothes and pinned the relics to their coats, hoping that the divine spirit that inspired Whitefield would protect them in battle. The colonial lower classes rejected Puritanism and Anglicanism, and at the same time, the colony's elite people questioned old religious systems as well. Unlike the lower classes, who embraced fiery evangelicalism, wealthy Americans instead adopted the ideals of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a European philosophical movement that emphasized education, science, and rationalism. Inspired by the Reformation of the 16th century, Enlightenment scholars like John Locke, Baron Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that humans had certain unalienable rights that good political leaders were bound to respect, since legitimate governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, rather than divine right or brute force. Unlike the Reformation, which called for a return to orthodox Christian principles, followers of the Enlightenment questioned core Christian beliefs. For example, many children of the Enlightenment, including some founding fathers, like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, were deists. Deists believed in a God, a divine being or creator, but they did not think that God intervened in the affairs of humanity. Deists also denied key biblical miracles, like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but they still respected Christian moral principles. Upper-class Americans questioned the legitimacy of British government through their criticism of religion, while lower-class Americans repudiated Britain through their increased religiosity. The colonists also lived far better and had a higher standard of living than their European counterparts. The colonists had more and better food to eat, especially meat. The typical diet of a European commoner in the 18th century consisted of bread and grain porridge, called pottage. They consumed their bread and pottage with root vegetables, like turnips, onions, and carrots, and potatoes introduced from the Americas. More well-off peasants might add the occasional chicken egg or dairy product to this meager diet. The peasants rarely ate meat, typically consuming it only during holidays and feast days. Americans also ate porridges and root vegetables, but they ate a lot more meat, both from wild game and domesticated animals. The colonists' varied diet has been confirmed by archaeologists, who have discovered and investigated their trash piles, called middens, and their outhouse toilets, called privies or necessaries. Archaeologists have found bones and faunal material in these depositories, leading them to see how varied the colonial American diet actually was. European observers were shocked to see that American colonists, even the poor, tended to be several inches taller than their counterparts back in Europe. As the 17th century wore into the 18th century, the colonists rejected their initial small one-room wattle and daub houses and instead began to build larger domiciles with added separate bedrooms and outbuildings, as shown by the floor plans of colonial homes and archaeological digs completed on the colonists' long-lost homesteads. The colonists had come to favor larger homes with separate bedrooms due to rising trends of individualism and privacy. The colonists, especially those of the nascent middle class, believed that it was important to separate sleeping in common areas. Religious colonists, like the wealthy Quakers of Pennsylvania, even went so far as to make sure that each of their children had their own private bedrooms, where they could explore their inner light in peace. Religious colonists were also beginning to believe that sex and physical intimacy needed to be more private, as adults began to build master bedrooms where they could have privacy from their children and servants or slaves. The colonists also began to build large but ornate chests in which they stored their clothing, primarily undergarments, their unmentionables. This belief in individualism and privacy, core American values, would also undermine the colonists' loyalty to the mother country, as they began to think of themselves as their own people, not subject to a king or parliament across the Atlantic Ocean. Developments like Americanization, which saw the American colonists begin to live their lives in ways that were different from their counterparts in Europe, combined simultaneously with the colonists' higher standard of living and taste for imported British goods, Anglicization. Both of these trends actually caused friction between the settlers and their mother country. As we discussed previously, the British Empire, in the wake of the French and Indian War, began to retire their benign neglect relationship with the American colonists. The British Parliament wanted the colonists to shoulder the financial costs of the war, a conflict they believed the colonists had caused. Although the war had been a massive victory for Britain, it was very expensive, costing about £50 million, almost doubling the British national debt at the time. To this end, Parliament called for taxes to be levied on goods the colonists imported from Britain. Parliament also called for the strengthening and increased enforcement of the old embargoes to make sure that the colonists did not just buy foreign, untaxed goods. Apprehended blockade runners were to be tried in British Admiralty courts rather than receive jury trials in the colonies, because the juries tended to side with the defendants rather than the British prosecution. The British put taxes on a variety of goods, including paper and eventually tea, both of which were becoming essential parts of Anglicized and Americanized colonial life. It should be noted, though, that the British also lowered taxes on some items, like sugar, with the hope that the colonists would legally purchase these goods, ideally from British colonies in the Caribbean, rather than buying them illegally from foreign smugglers. This lowering of taxes hurt the smugglers' revenue. Smuggling had become a major industry in the colonies, leading to contrabandists like John Hancock joining the Patriots. To make matters worse, the colonists could not pay these taxes using printed paper money. They had to pay with British currency, which was all the more difficult since the colonies were experiencing a recession at the end of the French and Indian War. British paper that had properly been taxed bore a stamp, signaling that the purchaser had paid the import duty to the British government. The stamp tax, with its symbol of imperial power and regulation, the British Crown, became a rallying point for the colonists against the mother country. The colonists convened a Stamp Act Congress in 1765, in which they petitioned the British government for the removal of the odious stamp tax. They also called for their own representation in Parliament. The British government responded that the colonists did not need representatives on the floor of Parliament. As colonists, they had virtual representation in the person of the British monarch, in this case, King George III, who had ascended the throne in 1760 during the French and Indian War. While elite colonists met in congresses to peacefully petition the government, lower-class colonists reverted to more violent means of tax revolt, including the burning of effigies in imperial bureaucrats, the ransacking of British officials' homes, and in some cases, assaults against tax collectors and custom agents, including the use of tarring and feathering. Colonial leaders, while they disavowed this violence, had a long tradition of tolerating mobs like these, believing that the lower classes' riots, quote-unquote out of doors as they were called, acted as a pressure release, preventing the colonies from falling into full-scale revolt and anarchy, as seen during Bacon's Rebellion, which we have discussed before. The most effective way that the colonists resisted the Stamp Act, though, was through non-importation, or the boycott of British goods. As a result of these acts of resistance in the colonies, along with petitions from British merchants whose export revenue had been lowered by the taxes and the boycotts, the hated Stamp Act was repealed in 1766 to relief on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. In exchange, Parliament issued the Declaratory Act, which stated the colonies were bound to follow future parliamentary laws, even though they still had no real representation in Parliament. Although the Stamp Act had been a debacle for the British government, Parliament instituted a series of new taxes called the Townshend Acts of 1767. Named after British tax official Charles Townshend, the Townshend Acts taxed a variety of goods, including paint, glass, and tea. All three of these goods were essential for both the Anglicization and Americanization of the American colonies. Paint and glass were necessary for the construction and adornment of the expanding American homes. And tea, with its accompanying service rituals, helped colonists feel genteel and connected to the British Empire. The revenue from these taxes was earmarked to the enforcement of embargo laws and to garrison additional British troops in the American colonies, two things the colonists detested. In response to the indignities of the Townshend Acts, the colonists once again boycotted British goods and came together to condemn the legitimacy of taxation without representation. Early colonial leaders like John Dickinson, author of the anonymous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, declared that non-resistance to these taxes was a tacit consent to them, and that the taxes could only be made illegitimate through colonial resistance. Benjamin Franklin wrote that tax revenue generated in the colonies ought to go to government services and projects that the American colonists actually supported, not things they imposed, like embargo enforcement or British troop garrisons. As was the case with the Stamp Act, British exports to the colonies declined steeply, and all of the Townshend Acts, except for the duty on tea, were repealed in 1770. 1770 was also an important year as it saw the Boston Massacre, an important, if small, violent interaction between the British military and American colonists. The British government, since 1765 and the Stamp Act, had increased its garrisons of troops in the American colonies, centering their deployment on major coastal urban centers like Boston. Boston was the site of a lot of smuggling, so it was natural that the troops were deployed there. The troops' deployment in Boston angered Bostonians from a variety of backgrounds. Obviously, the smugglers hated having the troops stationed in their city, but everyday middle-class Bostonians did not like having the troops in their city, as they were billeted or quartered in the colonists' barns, stables, and taverns, and also on shared spaces like the Boston Common or Town Square. What is more, in an age before credit cards, British troops did not always pay for their bills or goods or services on time when they did business with colonial merchants. Lower-class colonists also chafed under the British occupation as well. The underpaid British soldiers sought odd jobs during their liberty hours, driving down wages for working-class Bostonians, who were already feeling the squeeze of the economic slowdown that came as a result of the boycotts. Poor men and women rioted frequently in colonial America, and while the colonial elite often looked the other way during these riots, the same could not be said for the British Army. On March 5, 1770, an angry mob was harassing a squadron of British troops, pelting the soldiers with snowballs, rocks, and sharp oyster shells. The crowd grew quickly, soon including at least 300 rioters. The squad's leader, Captain William Preston, ordered the angry crowd to disperse, while commanding his men to load their muskets and assume a defensive position. The crowd continued to assault the soldiers, daring them to fire their muskets. Then the troops attacked the crowd, firing into them and killing 5 of the rioters, wounding 3 more. Among the killed was Crispus Attucks, an African American. Scholars consider Attucks to be the first American killed during the Revolution, as well as the first African American killed during the Revolution, even if full-scale combat between Britain and the colonies would not begin for another 5 years. The British troops were arrested, and rather than being court-martialed in Britain by a military tribunal, they were put on trial in a civilian court in Boston. While the city was divided between patriots and loyalists, many expected the soldiers would not receive a fair trial and would be executed for killing the rioters in self-defense. As an aside, the patriots often referred to themselves as Whigs, after the British political party that supported their anti-tax stance. Loyalists were often known as Tories because the Tory party took a harder line against the colonies. Many patriots/Whigs believed that it was important that the soldiers receive a fair trial, as convicting them in a biased, kangaroo-style court would damage their movement and transform the convicted soldiers into martyrs for the loyalists/Tories. The soldiers' defense was a local lawyer named John Adams, a patriot leader, and eventually the second president of the United States. Though he was a patriot, Adams defended the soldiers using both skilled legal techniques and racist invective. For example, Adams decried the mob as being made up of dangerous black men like Attucks and unruly Irishmen and sailors. While we might not appreciate Adams' racist rhetoric, we can admire his commitment to helping his clients that he would have opposed in order to get a fair day in court. Adams' arguments worked, and 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted of murder, although 2 were convicted of manslaughter, for which they had their thumbs branded. The Boston Massacre was a significant event in the American Revolution and the colony's path towards war with Great Britain. It was the first case of British troops spilling American blood, but it also showed the organization of the American patriots who, though angry at the killing of their people by the soldiers, realized that they must not betray their principles in the name of revenge. Years later, John Adams declared the American Revolution truly began on March 5, 1770. As an aside, 4 of the rioters were tried in Boston for their role in fomenting the mob, but all were acquitted. Things were relatively quiet in 1771, but in 1772 and 1773, relations between the British Empire and the American colonists would become more strained and destructive. On June 9, 1772, the British customs schooner H.M.S. Gaspee ran aground off the coast of Rhode Island. The schooner had been pursuing an American smuggler, the Hannah. Trapped in the shallow water, the Gaspee was not able to escape an angry mob of Americans from Providence, who came aboard the vessel, subdued the crew, burnt the ship, and shot the vessel's skipper, although he did survive his wound. In response, the British apprehended and tried the men who burned the Gaspee, but they were unable to convict them due to a lack of evidence they had captured the real conspirators. 1773 saw an even more contentious destruction of British property, the Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, Bostonian patriots who were members of the Sons of Liberty, an anti-British secret society, boarded 2 British vessels in Boston Harbor. The vessels were called the Beaver and the Dartmouth, and they threw the vessel's cargo of tea overboard. Tea had been a taxed good since 1767 under the Townshend Act, but the British government's grant of tea importation rights to the massive East India Company threatened the already strained business of colonial shippers and smugglers. In other colonies, the colonists had prevented the unloading of British tea, but Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a committed Tory, was determined to see the tea unloaded and sold. Something had to be done to keep the boycott going. In response, the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, brother of John Adams, planned to destroy the tea in Boston Harbor. The Sons of Liberty men boarded the British vessels under cover of darkness and disguised as Mohawk Indians. Then they threw the tea into Boston Harbor. The colonists' choice to disguise themselves as Native Americans is significant. First, it allowed the Sons of Liberty men to hide their identities, since their destruction of the tea was an illegal act. Second, it gave the Patriot conspirators a tangible way to signal that they were no longer British subjects, but true Americans, just like the continent's indigenous people. The colonists threw the tea into the harbor, destroying about 92,000 pounds by weight, valued at 10,000 British pounds, almost $2 million US today. Unlike the Gaspee raiders, the Boston conspirators were disciplined in their attack, avoiding violence against the ship's crews. They even made sure to sweep the decks to make sure that all the tea had been destroyed, and they also verified that none of their men stole any of the tea for themselves. The Boston Tea Party was a contentious and polarizing event in colonial British relations. While many patriot colonists supported the destruction of the tea, others thought the Sons of Liberty had gone too far. Across the pond, British politicians who had previously been sympathetic to the plight of the American colonists were angered by the act, and in response took a harder line against the colonies. The British government, in response to the Boston Tea Party, passed a series of retaliatory legislations called the Coercive Acts in 1774. The Coercive Acts, which came to be known as the Intolerable Acts, in America did three things. First, the acts revoked Massachusetts' colonial charter, effectively taking away the colony's home rule. This revocation alarmed the people of all 13 colonies, who realized that if Massachusetts could lose its charter, then so could they. Second, the Intolerable Acts allowed Massachusetts governor, the loyalist Thomas Hutchinson, to send British defendants back to England for trial, meaning the jury would be British instead of American. American smugglers had previously been sent back to Britain to be tried in admiralty courts, but the Intolerable Acts conversely allowed British defendants to be tried back in Britain, where they would be acquitted, undermining the colonial justice system, which had actually worked pretty well during the Boston Massacre of 1770. The final thing the Intolerable Acts did was including a provision called the Quartering Act, which allowed British Army officers to requisition colonial property, including private homes, for the building of British troops, although the troops were generally garrisoned in unoccupied buildings, like barns or warehouses, rather than inhabited domiciles. The Quartering Act applied to all colonies, not just Massachusetts. At the same time of the Intolerable Acts, Britain also passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which mandated the Ohio country belong to the Catholic, French-speaking province of Quebec, rather than the English colonies. The Quebec Act angered American frontiersmen who wanted to settle in the Ohio country but did not want to live under the rule of the Quebecois. Britain's coercive acts were intended to crush colonial resistance, but instead they did the opposite, bringing the colonies together against British rule. In response to the acts, the colonies formed committees of correspondence, which sent delegates to a council called the First Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia from September 5th to October 26th, 1774. Every colony except Georgia, which had a higher loyalist population, sent delegates. The delegates disagreed over how they should respond to the Intolerable Acts. More cautious attendees, like John Dickinson, whom we discussed earlier, urged that the delegates work within the British governmental system to redress their grievances. More radical attendees, like John Adams and Patrick Henry of Virginia, who famously said, "Give me liberty or give me death," disagreed, considering armed struggle instead. In the end, the Congress compromised and called for a colonies-wide trade embargo on all British trade, including the importation of enslaved Africans. The First Continental Congress issued a series of statements about the nature of the American colonies' relationship with Britain. The Congress declared that the American colonists were still British subjects, and thus had a right to certain resolves, including life, liberty, and property, as well as representation in the British government. The colonies also should not be bound by any unique laws that did not affect the people of Britain, like the garrisoning of troops in colonial property during peacetime. In the end, the First Continental Congress did not call for separation from Great Britain, but their Declaration of Resolves would later inspire independence calls, like the 1776 Declaration of Independence. The First Continental Congress, which was intended to offer a compromise and seek peace with Britain, actually did the opposite. The Congress's demands hardened the British government, in particular King George III, the colonists' virtual representative. It turned his opinion against the colonies. The Congress also further galvanized the American colonies, whose citizens realized the British government, in particular the king, would not peacefully give up their demands. While patriot sentiment grew, especially in New England and the mid-Atlantic, loyalism remained popular in the newer Deep South colonies like Georgia and South Carolina. In the end, it was not one single event in the 1760s and early 1770s that moved the Anglo-American colonies to war with Great Britain. Rather, it was a series of cultural changes that created differences between Britain and the colonists. The colonists opposed the taxes the British government levied on key goods that they regularly imported, items that Anglo-Americans had come to depend on in their movements of Anglicization and Americanization. The colonists resented this taxation without representation and organized boycotts and congresses that called for the repeal of these taxes. The colonists also chafed under the changes the British government was making to its relationship with the colonies. Parliament and the king wanted to centralize and integrate the colonies and make them pay their fair share for their role in starting the costly French and Indian War. To this end, the British government deployed troops in the colonies to keep the colonists in line. The colonists resented the deployment of the British troops, particularly their quartering on private property. The friction between the colonists and troops helped to inspire the Boston Massacre of 1770, which created the first martyrs for the colonial independence cause. Later events, like the Boston Tea Party of 1773, caused the British government to take an even harsher stance against the colonists by undermining their colonial charters. The British government also prevented Western expansion on the frontier and increased the quartering of British troops on colonial property. The colonial elite tried to make peace with Britain at the Continental Congress of 1774, but their efforts for unification only drove the colonies and the mother country further apart. War was on the horizon. We'll discuss the armed conflict between Great Britain and the American colonies in future videos.